Well, welcome to the IISS. The title of the meeting is The Campaign Against ISIS Succeeding. Succinctly puts the dilemma that's certainly going to be on the minds of many of the government ministers and key actors at the peace talks at the moment. Our speaker, Linda Robinson, is a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation, and she's come at some speed from Cambridge, where RAND organised a couple of very interesting workshops yesterday. Linda is a policy analyst, but she's a policy analyst who marches to the sound of the guns. Many of you will know of her excellent book about the Iraq War, Tell Me How This Ends, which is full of vignettes and frontline detail that really brings to life the operational and strategic issue. I'd also commend to you two recent pieces of work she'd done. This is on the RAND Corporation website. Lessons from 13 Years of War Point to a Better US Strategy. And it's an excellent summary of a piece of work she did called Improving Strategic Competence, which was really about the lessons for strategic leaders and managers from the US effort to run the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's an extremely high quality piece of work that succinctly has 7 lessons. And it set the bar very high, for example, for the UK's Iraq inquiry in terms of succinctness and power to weight ratio. And the same applies to a piece of work she did last year, which was her assessment of the counter-ISIL campaign 1 year after Mosul, which was based on visits to Kuwait and Iraq and Jordan. And Linda has continued to work on this, and she's brought with her a 2-page summary of her recent article in Foreign Affairs, copies of which are on the desk by the coffee bar, which any of you can pick up afterwards, where she's looked particularly at the contribution of special operations forces to the campaign. Linda's going to talk for about half an hour. She's got some slides, which I think you'll find quite useful, and then there'll be an opportunity for a wider discussion. Linda.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning. Thank you very much for arriving here in the middle of your day to have this conversation. And I will count on Ben to help rein me in on my remarks so we have time for a full discussion. I think there's a lot of expertise and a variety of perspectives in the audience. So I want to make sure we have that interactive time. So whatever research I've done that's of interest and use to you, I can provide. I have a very simple agenda here, and I'm going to move very quickly through the first slides just to kind of orient you to some basics. Many of you may already be familiar, but I want to highlight what I think are the most salient characteristics of ISIL. As Ben mentioned in his very welcome introduction, I've been looking at Iraq for quite a long time, and ISIL, of course, is just the latest manifestation of a series of Sunni-based groups there that we've been dealing with for quite a while. I was in the opening days of Operation Iraqi Freedom, coming up through Kuwait into Basra and then moving up from there through the country. And I was in the British AO for the beginning area of operations in the beginning part of the war. So I also want to briefly review what the strategy, U.S. strategy is that the coalition has more or less signed up to. And then I want to quickly go through 3 maps that I think will just provide a visual orientation. Then I'll give you the findings of my political military analysis. And I also want to acknowledge, Ben has done excellent work. You have Toby Dodge here. There's a great depth here at IISS. And as a member for 25 years, I'm very pleased to be back at IISS and see many people I know. And then I will wind up with a few recommendations and try to give what I believe is a kind of nuanced answer to this question of are we succeeding or not. So moving ahead to the ISIL slide very quickly. This is a group that has been underestimated. I think right now people are kind of reckoning with its full potency, but for the first year, I was running a workshop on Iraq the day that Mosul was overrun, and I just distinctly remember there was a sort of core group of people that had been following Iraq, watching the rise of ISIL, watching them move in, and there were predictions, but they weren't really listened to. And I think at this juncture, 18 months on, there's a much greater appreciation now of its, what I would call its twin nature. The leadership is largely Iraqi, and there are Iraqi motivations and Iraqi objectives in addition to the jihadist caliphate objectives. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. They have, as I mentioned, a very highly refined capability in the military intelligence and counterintelligence realms, and this organization isn't just a recreation of the old organization. It's an improved version, and it has been able to exert much more control over the population and territory that it has been sitting on than many people predicted. There were a lot of early predictions that it would implode through its own inefficacy or brutality, and that has not been the case. And tactically and operationally, they have innovated some new measures that they didn't before. Of course, the story of Iraq writ large has been always building bigger and better bombs that we call IEDs, but they're just bombs. But there have been much more sophisticated uses of those, much more lethal uses, both offensively and defensively. And as we saw, the emblematic example I use of their agility is when forces were concentrated on Tikrit last year, they simply moved off. It was not a defeat of them. It was a tactical withdrawal, and they simply moved to Ramadi, which had been under siege, and took it over. So they understand that standing and fighting doesn't really give them the best propaganda bang for the buck. If they feel they can't win that fight, they go and attack somewhere else, and that gives them the headlines and increased WASTA as a group that can't be beaten. They have demonstrated resilience in terms of manpower, resupply, and leadership, although there hasn't been a great deal of leadership targeting for a good part of this time, and I can discuss why. And I think just to do the numbers game briefly, and I have one point to make about this. The estimates are always just estimates, but 30,000 is the current estimate of ISIL fighters. And what is important about that number is that is the same number at the high end, 30,000 of a year ago. So despite 20,000 enemy killed in action, we're still at 30. Now, I'm not one to argue that a body count is the valid metric of success, but suffice it to say that there are as many fighters out there now as there were earlier. And of course, there is a large contingent of foreign fighters, and that foreign fighter element has been generated through some very sophisticated propaganda and recruitment, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A, but that includes things like new innovations in the use of social media and relying very much on encrypted applications. And that is something that the US government FBI Director Comey has made an issue of, but frankly, the private sector is pretty dug in on some of the issues involved there, and I don't think we're going to have an easy resolution to that issue. And then finally, the expansion beyond. I'm going to speak to you mostly about Iraq and Syria, and this is what Secretary of Defense Carter calls the parent tumor. He's using a medical terminology in his way of describing this issue, that ISIS, core ISIS in Iraq and Syria, he calls the parent tumor, and he says it has metastasized, which I think is a correct term for at least some of these affiliates to other areas. There are 8 actual acknowledged wilayats or acknowledged affiliates now abroad. There are many more smaller groups that have pledged loyalty or allegiance, but they haven't been accepted by ISIL. The most important of these, of course, is Libya. And Libya is one of the affiliates that was deliberately created by ISIL. Some of these other affiliates have come about through opportunistic affiliation as the brand of Al-Qaeda has diminished and the brand of ISIL has grown. In Libya, there were members of the core ISIS leadership group sent there, one of whom, Abu Nabil, has been killed, but there are leadership figures there, and it's pretty, I think it's not too far a conjecture to say this affiliate was set up as an ideal rear guard or possible substitute area as their ability, freedom of movement in Iraq and Syria is diminished. They're able increasingly to operate out of there, which is a completely ungoverned state with no, I think, near-term prospect of having a functioning government or security force, a platform with which to create mayhem throughout North Africa, and a platform to get into Europe. So it is, it's a serious element, and I don't want to, by focusing on Iraq and Syria, the parent tumor in my remarks, I don't want to diminish the importance of what's going on in Libya. To briefly characterize the U.S. strategy, it has 9 lines of effort. And I'm going to focus on the first ones, the political line of effort, and 2 and 3, which are the military lines of effort. And the military lines of effort are to deny safe haven and build partner capacity in Iraq and Syria. And line of effort number 1, I will come back to at the end of my remarks to integrate the political aspects in this. Lines 4 through 7 are really what I call inputs to that central problem. And of course, line 9 is protect the U.S. homeland, which you could almost say that's the overarching objective, but you have to do all of these things in order to prevent ISIL from becoming an active threat to the homeland. So I'm going to go ahead to the 3 maps. And we can come back to these maps. I do want to keep moving here. There's a lot of detail in the maps, but I would like to just direct your attention to the green on this map as my primary point. This represents the territory reclaimed from ISIL since the beginning of the war. And there are a lot of different maps out there. Some of them are just showing the more recent gains, but I felt this provided you the best overview. And what we had in the middle area of the green is, let's see, excuse me, is that the right, there we go. This may not show up very well, the pointer. So the central area of green down to Kirkuk is the area that was first reclaimed primarily through support to the Kurdish Peshmerga forces in Iraq. And then down below that where you see Tikrit, this was an area primarily regained when the Shia militia forces of Iraq moved in with some Iraqi military, but there was heavy involvement there by the Shia militias, and we can talk about them more in a minute. And then up in the top of the map, that green area in Syria was reclaimed primarily through our support to the Syrian Kurdish forces. The YPG is the acronym for their name. And then the dark brown area shows the ISIL gains. So while they were being pushed out of some territory, it's very important to note that they were making some serious inroads. And most significantly, of course, Ramadi fell. It was just retaken, but it did fall in May. I was there in Iraq right after it fell, and that, I would say, was really the low point, the nadir of this entire experience thus far, because it set back the confidence of the government, the confidence of the military in a very critical way. The other significant movement, ISIL moved west, and it's much larger actually than this brown area here. They moved further to encircle the southern perimeter there, and we have, I think now, a war that has blended from the Western war that had largely been the anti-Assad war. We now have a very mixed soup. I call it a Gordian knot because there's no easy way out of the Syrian part of this conflict. But ISIL moved west, and that is a movement that has not yet been reversed. There were very recently some successes in Iraq, and it began with the Beiji. There was a seesaw battle for Beiji and the Beiji oil refinery, and the Iraqi forces were simply not able to kick out the ISIS forces, and there was a contingent of Iraqi special operations forces marooned up there, and they couldn't get resupply. The only time they had resupply was some aerial drops. There was no one pushing up to rescue them, to help them break out. They suffered enormous casualties, and this partly explained the debacle of Ramadi and why all of the forces left there, because partly the CTS, the Iraqi Special Operations Forces, were concerned that once again they were going to be left holding the bag. And that is one unit. I've spent a lot of time with them since 2003 when they were formed, through their various iterations, and they are a mixed force. Shia, Sunni, Kurd. They have been in the fight. We, the U.S. Special Operations Forces, have consistently trained them, in addition to some other coalitions, SOF. And so they are kind of the glimmer of hope of what right looks like in Iraq if we can get there. But they are just a very small portion of the overall forces. And I've kind of jumped the gun into my next slide here, describing who's where on the Iraqi battlefield. So I'll just quickly note the purple in the top and the orange are the Kurdish forces. And the reason there are two colors is the Kurdish Peshmerga are not a unitary element. For those of you who know, there is the KDP and the PUK, the two Kurdish parties, each of whom have their own rivalrous armed groups. So nothing about Iraq is easy. The yellow area in the middle, as I mentioned, the Shia militia groups are very dominant there, and not only in the clearing operations last year, but they still own a lot of the highways, and they are in essence performing a lot of the hold function now. And that, of course, does not make the Sunni population terribly happy, but again, for the weakness and the lack of other hold forces, that is what is happening. And I will give you some numbers, but I caution all numbers are squishy. 80,000 to 100,000 is the ballpark for these militia groups. And these militia groups go under the umbrella of Popular Mobilization Forces. And I don't want to make your eyes spin around in your head, but it is important to understand that those comprise, the Popular Mobilization Forces include militias that just arose when this latest crisis occurred, and Ayatollah Sistani called for Iraqis to stand up and defend their country. So a lot of mostly Shia men came up under arms and joined these ad hoc groups. And it's important to note that Ayatollah Sistani did not say only Shia come out. He called broadly for Iraqis to come and defend their country. And he's actually a very important nationalist and I think a pivotal figure in where Iraq goes. The other part of the Popular Mobilization Force, though, are very problematic groups, very tied to Iran, the Badr Brigade, Kataib Hezbollah, and Asaib al-Haq. And those are elements that have been very problematic, implicated in a lot of killings of American soldiers, are very much armed, advised, and directed with close ties to Iran. But they're out there on the battlefield, and the views that I received as I went around interviewing people, and including I was in the Joint Operations Center, they have actually representatives in there. So like it or not, they are part of the fabric of the defense of Iraq right now. And that poses some dilemmas, but I will provide you a few conclusions about what I think is the most realistic way to look at the road ahead. And then finally, the green area is the Shia majority area of Iraq, where you have largely the preponderance of Iraqi security forces are there guarding Shia Iraq. So one reason this fight has been so slow is the core interest of the Shia-led government of Baghdad, of course, is to protect its Shia population and up through Baghdad. So there is, again, the numbers on the disposition of forces is very fluid. We have a very hard time even determining who is present for duty in a given unit. But certainly the preponderance of forces are still arrayed there in southern Iraq and central Baghdad. Quickly on Syria, the main thing, as I said before, is there are two fights. The fight of the east is ISIL, and the fight of the west is the anti-Assad fight. And the stars, I selected this map just to bring in the element of Russia and its entry into the war and the airstrikes. And this is dated information, but the pattern has continued. Russia, despite what it says, has been clearly targeting those forces opposing Assad, not ISIL. The very bare minimum of their strikes have been against ISIL, and they clearly intend to create facts on the ground that will shore up Assad and give him control of the key Alawite and highly populated western part of the country. And we can come back to that because, again, it's a very complex situation, and we're not getting, there is one thing from Russia, as I say in my foreign affairs piece, Russia's utility in this Syrian theater from the standpoint of U.S. interest is one thing: pressure Assad to go for a transitional government, because that is what will unlock the Gordian knot. We simply cannot win it by making an alliance with Russia because of ground forces and what the ground forces, i.e. the Syrians, want. And we cannot impose a deal on their heads and expect the center to hold here. So I'd like to now just talk about the main 3 bullet points, and we can go into more details as you are interested. My overall analysis stepped back to look at, well, what are the approaches to this problem? And broadly, they fall into 3 categories: a containment approach, a reliance on the partner ground forces, or a large U.S. or external invasion force. And the U.S. administration has obviously selected that middle road. And I think, broadly speaking, that middle road is the correct one because, first of all, the other 2 are highly problematic. In this type of war, containment is a very dubious and difficult thing to execute. And we've seen that over the first year of low results and what air power has and has not been able to do. And certainly the invasion force, were there even the political appetite to do this, it's highly problematic in that you can achieve military effects, but you can very, very easily create more ISIL recruits, and you certainly have an exit strategy problem because you don't have any hold force. And that's really, I think, unfortunately, still the default option for many traditional military minds is, yes, we can go in with heavy brigades, combat divisions, and we can destroy a city or take a city. But then what is the big question? And President Obama has repeatedly asked that question, then what? So as I say, with bullet number 2, the indigenous ground forces are the key thing. You are not going to be able to take and hold this territory and eject ISIL without that. Now, as I did the detailed analysis of all of these forces on the ground, they all have limited capabilities and they all have varied interests, to some degree divergent with what the U.S. would like, but also among themselves. And I can go through in more detail. One thing I do want to broadcast is that we have put a lot of emphasis on what the Kurdish forces have done, and they have achieved a great deal. Both the Iraqi and Syrian Kurds have achieved a great deal, but they are at the limits of both their interest and their capability. They are not going to go in and retake the Sunni territory, and furthermore, they do not want to. Their interests are an eventual road toward independence, or at least a more solidified autonomous area in the case of Syria. So, and they now have the oil areas of northern Iraq, and that is their gold mine for funding an independent Kurdistan. So we just need to understand, however valiant they are as fighters and how, I mean, they've got terrific PR. They really have become kind of everybody's poster child for this war, but they have their own interests, and it's very important to remember that. So finally, the 3rd bullet is really the meat of this, which is, so while we have had broadly, I believe, the right strategy, the ways and means have been inadequate. So that is why we have not achieved more effect to date with what I believe is the most promising approach. Nothing is ever going to be easy, not in Iraq. Iraq's complex, Syria is even more complex. So I do not want to make this seem simple at all, but we will not get there without more means and more appropriate ways. And this, I think, has been acknowledged in the terms that the administration is using in terms of acceleration of the campaign. And that's where we have been since October. I want to now speak just briefly about the political dilemmas. As I've already signaled, you are not going to get to the end game without more Sunnis in as the hold force in both of these countries. And that is something that is going to require, first of all, the Iraqi government to support that. There are only between 7,000 and 8,000 Sunni tribal fighters. Only a fraction of those, maybe half, have actually been trained by the U.S., and the arming of them has been very slow. Also, in regard to Syria, we have put a lot of eggs in the Kurdish basket. We're now trying to get the Arabs on board, and also the Druze and some other elements there. Turkey, of course, has been supporting the Turkmens, but that is an imbalance that needs to be rectified as well. Now, the overall political solutions are really part of the end game. What is going to create a stable Iraq? Some people have long said it just needs to be 3 separate countries, but the Sunni area is not a viable entity. It doesn't have resources, and the various Sunni factions will not agree to be governed by each other. That is my own analysis of their political stances. However, they're moving more toward acceptance of a federalized Iraq solution, and that is in the Constitution and that is foreseen, but we just don't have enough political energy behind that, and Prime Minister Abadi is really hanging by a thread. We have, in my view, one of the main critiques on the political side is we have not provided visible and robust enough support to him, who he's the best you're going to get in Iraq as a leader now, and he has a very delicate balancing act to perform between his various Shia political competitors at home and, of course, with Iran next door, and Iran next door is not leaving. It is there permanently. And then finally, the political solution in Syria, if it does survive as a state, it will absolutely be a confederal state. And as I said before, in my view, the Syrian people will not accept Assad's permanence. And so that quest that Secretary Kerry has now reinitiated for a diplomatic solution is the way to go, but it must be backed by, in my view, support to our allies on the ground. Because if you just stand back and let Russia, in support of Assad, clear out that western area, there will be absolutely no incentive for Russia to pressure Assad to agree to a transitional government and make that Geneva formula work. Iran, I believe, has some limits to what they're willing to pour into that country, and partly it is the underlying weakness of the Syrian regime forces. They are largely propped up now by the NDF, which is a militia force created and led, heavily advised by Iran, by Iraqi militias, by Lebanese Hezbollah. The Syrian forces per se are greatly degraded, and I don't think that we should grant a second life to the Assad regime if we can put more force behind supporting our allies there. Finally, just to conclude, I think ISIL will continue launching attacks. It is, I think, correct to cite Churchill here and say, we may be at the end of the beginning. And that's the best assessment I can give you. We're at the end of the beginning. The recent gains in Ramadi, the retaking of Ramadi, shows that this was a critical shot in the arm. I don't know that I'd call it a turning point, but it was a critical shot in the arm for the Iraqi security forces, who proved they could retake a city without a major role by the Shia militia forces. They used some new combined arms tactics. They were able to clear heavily mined areas. They're going to take and refine those tactics and use them for the much bigger challenge of Raqqa and Mosul. Mosul will be, I think, the most severe test of the military capability. And then finally, as I want to hit again, we have achieved military victories, Kobani, Sinjar, and Ramadi, largely by destroying those cities. And that is going to create further grievance for Sunni populations unless the money is there to reconstruct those cities and provide adequate relief for the Sunnis. And the Iraqi government is dead broke. So this is a critical piece of the way ahead. And then finally, incorporating Sunni Arabs into not just the fighting force, but trying to map out their role in the Iraq to come. And that is something they are not going to come back into a position of power. They will have to accept their minority status, but unless a place is found for them, this conflict will brew on. I have a number of recommendations, but it basically revolves around doing more, and we can talk about the details of that. But I in no way would say we need combat units on the ground. This is a key test, frankly, of whether the U.S. and whether its coalition partners can really do what the U.S. calls security force assistance, enabling a partner to do the job itself. We know the American military, the UK military can go in and create military effects, but are we able to play that more nuanced judo game and help a partner force become truly capable? And that's something, and that was what my improving strategic competence was about, was number one, perfecting that way of helping other forces, and number two, integrating the military with the political line of operations. And we really need to energize those political operations enabled by the military ways. Thank you. I think that's probably quite enough to begin the conversation. Thank you, Ben.
Well, thank you, Linda. We've now got exactly half an hour for a wider discussion. Linda would welcome questions. If you could catch my eye, and I'll call for one of the roving microphones to come to you. And could you please, when you pose the question, identify yourself and the organisation you represent? And given the considerable amount of potential interest, could you please keep your question as short as possible? Okay, gentleman in the front here on the left.
Thank you very much. My name is Mehrdad Konsari. I'm a member of the Institute. My question is just referring to your very last comment, that you said that can we enable our partners to do the job for themselves? Is this a strategy that has to be pursued? Maybe it will work or maybe it won't work. I mean, what does that really mean? Because so far the assistance that has been provided has not been able to do the job. Is it a priority, for example, to try and remove ISIL from all their strategic strongholds, let's say in this current year? Is this considered as a priority? And if removing them from their strategic strongholds is an obvious sign that the war is against them is going to be won, can one just rely on this wishful hope that the local partners, just by simply being enabled in the sense that you said, which wasn't definitive, might achieve what has to be achieved? And if not, for example, can countries like Iran be induced to play a role which is missing in terms of boots on the ground and things like that, options of that nature, now that there is some kind of dialogue with Iran?
Okay, well, I think I counted about 5 separate questions there, but there was an overarching theme.
Yes,
Linda.
thank you. No, that was a very sophisticated commentary, and I didn't dwell on Iran, so I will take that part of your question as well, but I do want to acknowledge there is a lot of skepticism, and certainly as we saw the months go by after the fall of Ramadi and nothing was happening, and people thought, how could you not, why isn't the Iraqi government going to a major city so close to its capital to retake it? But they did retake it, and the signs are the signs are pretty good. Although, as I mentioned, it was a destroyed city. So militarily, that was an important evidence of the fact that we've trained now 17,500 is the round number of Iraqi military forces trained, plus another 2,000 police, and about, as I say, 5,000 we've had a hand in some degree of training with the Sunni tribes. So that is not enough, and they are very degraded from what they were when we stopped training them, which was really about 2010. There was a lot of politicization. There's a real leadership and morale issue. So I don't want to pretend it's easy to rebuild the force, but we have now seen the first signs of the last year and a half of effort bear fruit. As I said, Mosul would be much more difficult, and Raqqa, of course, is going to have to be done by non-government forces, the Kurdish Arab Alliance, the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, that they're now putting together. But we have had, and what I should say about my recommendations is not just more advisors to help accelerate that and enable those forces, but we have largely we've supplied air support to ground forces, but we have not conducted an intelligence-driven campaign. And you're starting to see more effects from the air now as sources of intelligence are being improved, because that is really going to be, that's a tremendous multiplier of effect. So I think we're now getting to the point where enough of the right things are happening that you will see more effects. Is it a short road? No. Is it going to cost a lot? Yes. Iran is there and is supporting forces and is going to continue to do so. And there has been, we're kind of doing a bank shot in terms of coordinating and deconflicting, because we're working through the Iraqi government. There's no overt coordination between the US-led coalition and Iran. But there's an acknowledgement by everybody out there on the battlefield that they are there, they're a presence, they're going to be. Now, how much interest do they have in going up to Mosul? I don't think very much. And if you look at what Iran's interests are, they've basically secured their interests, which is the border, Baghdad, and probably this buffer zone that is represented by Tikrit and Samarra. And I think that now it's really, and there have been some overtures by the Iranians to some of our advisors on the ground saying, hey, we know you have better contacts with the Sunnis. Can you get them into the act to help do some more?
Linda, we've already got quite a few people queued up and waiting on the approach rate. So what I propose to do is to take questions in pairs.
Please.
And then you can choose.
And I'll be brief.
Yeah, no, don't worry. It's absolutely top stuff. But there's the gentleman on the aisle on the right here in a white sweater, and then the gentleman in the red turban next to him.
IS member Vipul Thakur, I got brief comment. We are not succeeding against the terrorists because of our so-called friends. There are powerful institutions in Saudi Arabia and other Sunni Gulf states. They keep financing these terrorist organizations. Turkey, most of the reinforcement for the terrorists go through Turkey, and why don't we put more pressure on them instead of giving money first, whether it's for this purpose or stopping flow of refugees into Europe, and then request them to do the job. And many countries, of course, supply manpower to the terrorists, and one of the main one is Pakistan. Again, I think we should impose some sanctions or bring pressure. Otherwise, we are fighting with one hand tied behind, and we cannot win. Thank you.
Okay, and the gentleman next to you.
This is good pairing, sir. Thank you. I'm G.S. Bedi from High Commission of India. Just taking on from the same thing, my question is about fighting the capability of acquired by ISIL, and which is essentially the military might. And now I believe their main economic tool is the oil. Someone is buying their oil and somebody is supplying weapons. My question is essentially that this movement of oil out and movement of weapons in must have a definite signature. In today's satellite communications and sub-metric resolutions, why is it that this movement is not being targeted? I mean, why are we targeting ISL once they've acquired the weapons and not really, targeting it once the weapons are moving in? And if I just briefly, the whole world seems to be united against ISL. Approaches may vary, but everyone agrees that this needs to go. So once you find the weapons, once you capture a few guys, those weapons are being produced in big ordnance factories. They're not homegrown pistols. So why is it not sort of made public that, where are these weapons coming from, where are they being made, and why are they being supplied to these guys?
Good, thank you. Shall I go ahead with these two?
Yes,
Very
please.
excellent, good questions. I'll take this one and then that one, but both very important. There is a large degree of their material is captured material, but absolutely the main conduit in and out has been through Turkey and has been through this area, the brown area up here, if you can see that. And that is the gap that they are now trying to close that will, I think, be a critical from the Mara line to Harbalus, for those of you who know the map. And closing that gap is actually, Turkey has stepped up to do that, and they're currently trying to negotiate the ways to do that, because what is Turkey's interest? They do not want that entire border controlled by the Syrian Kurds. So they are helping to energize an Arab force that will take that border area away from ISIL, and that will shut off their key remaining conduit. Also, what is happening in terms of the oil revenues is, I mentioned the intelligence-driven campaign. Because of the raid into Iraq that got Abu Sayyaf, I don't know, again, I'm sorry for so many details here, but there was a critical raid that it wasn't just that they killed this key facilitator in charge of oil and gas revenues, but they captured major documents that showed the network of how the oil business was working, and that has allowed them to target much more efficiently the resource side of it. And that kind of intelligence-driven campaign is what is really only now getting ramped up. So this is why, again, I will not at all say the first year of this campaign was anything but dismal, but I think some of the current the elements are now being put in place to do it. Now, you, sir, you raised a very fundamental question, and I did not address that in my presentation, and that is the engine of recruitment. And certainly Saudi Arabia has a role in that, and I know that one element of our strategy is the counter-violent extremism and trying to deter the recruitment. But I do view that as fundamentally the task of the Sunni Muslim community of the world. And Saudi Arabia certainly as a leader in that. And I don't think we yet have really thought deeply enough about what that means, because you can issue fatwas, but do these young men joining up, the 20, 30,000 more joining up, do they care what a fatwa says? What is motivating them? Who do they listen to? What are the sources of credibility and legitimacy? So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I would not say for a moment that we're doing the right things yet there.
Okay, now if we could go to the far right corner of the right, and first I'll call Lieutenant Colonel J.P. Clark from the US Army.
Thank you. I've already been introduced. So you alluded to both the necessity of a long-term, in Iraq, Sunni-Shia equitable, political settlement where the Sunnis are not so marginalized. And you also alluded to the very difficult internal Shia politics within Iraq. It seems that we have a kind of like a cruel dilemma in that when there are security pressures upon the government, that is when they're most likely to make some of those painful domestic gestures towards the Sunnis, and that as the fight goes better, there's less pressure on the Iraqi government, the Shia government, to make concessions to the Sunnis, and then they start playing within their own internal domestic game as well as with Iran. So how do we keep the pressure up for the political settlement at the same time that hopefully the military campaign is going better?
Can I just call someone else as well? I think behind the last questioner there was another person. Thanks.
Thank you. Alaric Hugh, I'm a member of the Institute, and also I run an energy hedge fund. I just wanted to double check your view on U.S. financial or willingness on the part of the U.S. to financially support other players in the region, such as the Kurds. Obviously, the KRG is not a recognized country, and that's limited IMF and World Bank capability to support directly. But from a cost-benefit analysis, presumably that's one of the easiest and cheapest ways to maintain local presence.
Interesting point. I would just say to this last question first, I mean, the oil that KRG is selling, as you know, obviously there's a legal dispute over whose oil that is. And so there is, I think the U.S. has rightly refrained from direct aid to the KRG. And my view is to do so really crosses a Rubicon. They may get there to be an independent country, but that should be a process that should not be galvanized by U.S. action, in my view, and primarily because you increase the friction with Baghdad and reduce the ability to help there, which leads me to the first question. And I would actually take some issue with that approach to it, because putting pressure on Abadi weakens him vis-a-vis Maliki, his main rival, the former prime minister who is there in the wings still creating problems. And Abadi has appealed for U.S. help. He wants U.S. aid in there as a balancer for Iranian aid. He does not want, and I believe that, in times of crisis, the Iraqi Shia have looked to Iran because they quickly came to their aid. While we were fussing around deciding what to do or not do, they were in there helping. And so I believe, number one, we have to support Abadi vis-a-vis his rivals. He is the most rational actor and is very dead serious about pursuing the decentralization of Iraq that is the political solution. And number two, to compete for influence with Iran. Because there are many people that just say it's become an Iranian protectorate. This is the future of Iraq will be under, Iranian dominion. I think that is a very wrong reading of Iraq and Iraq's history as a sovereign country. So I do think that, and that's why I think these political deals need to be brokered while Ayatollah Sistani is still alive, because he actually commands more respect than any other figure in Iraqi Shiadom and Shiadom at large.
And staying at the back of the right, Frank Gardner of the BBC.
Future predictions always a bit risky, but I wonder if you could give us some idea of where you see the campaign going over the next year. Do you see Mosul on that sort of time horizon?
Great question. Yes, I'm sorry.
And also the guy at the back of the left on the aisle.
My name is Jacob Omarodian.
Sorry, please use the microphone.
Yep. Jacob Omarodian from the Canadian High Commission. My question is about your views on the Russian dynamics. Just last week, the Foreign Affairs Parliamentary Committee also was commenting about where we are in the conflict right now. And we have two dynamics where Russia is starting to own some of the military capacities and confidence of the regime of late, but also an understandable timeline where the military involvement of the Russians, maybe due to internal systemic political factors, might reach a limit, at which point being pushed to a political solution might come into a role. So we have two dynamics where Russia is creating an advantage for Assad and his gains, but also the military side will eventually be exhausted in terms of Russian efforts to support. So I was wondering your views about where those two dynamics might collide in terms of a timeline and how that might affect negotiations.
And in a sense, those two questions are curiously related.
Yes, well, I will take this one first and then go to that very interesting question as well. But I think that I don't have a crystal ball, but there was Iraqi military leadership recently said they hope to get to Mosul by the end of this year or early 2017. And I think that is possible, but I want to note two competing priorities that they are going to have to sort out. While they have Ramadi, they have to keep Ramadi, and then there's all of Anbar still. And that may not be their best play because, again, you've got a lot of grievance there. You've got an unclear Sunni support structure there. You do have some Sunni tribes, but it might not be the critical area if you're, again, looking for the psychological benefit. But Mosul will take a concerted emphasis if they're going to do it. I don't think they can do both at once. So there's a choice there. And with regard to Syria, you know, there's been a lot of emphasis on moving on Raqqa, but you can't, the Syrian Kurds won't be able to retake Raqqa, so that depends on how many Arabs they are able to coalesce around that nucleus. And they're more focused right now actually on closing that gap that I was mentioning up there on the border. And they've had more success very recently with the Tishreen dam, and we've got a head of steam up there. So that might be conceivably the more important way of cutting off some key resources. And so you could just have the sort of anaconda approach that you're slowly closing in on those two main, Mosul and Raqqa. Continued progress, though, I think will give people more optimism. If things go into a stall now, then there'll be, again, much more pessimism about whether they've got enough going. The Russian factor is very important, and it's complex, but I will just boil it down to what I think are the key issues from Russia's point of view. And as Ben mentioned, we just spent the last 2 days on Russia, and a number of the interlocutors there said, you know, Russia never does something just for the country that it's in. You know, it's got a basic play for influence going on in all of these pieces they're trying to move around on the board. But one thing I'm certain of is Russia has no intention of going into Syria to create another Afghanistan for itself, right? There is a limit to the boots on the ground that they're willing to put in beyond some advisor forces. And as I mentioned, I see their real weakness there with the regime ability to hold ground with what it has. And I think Iran has the very same limitation. They put a lot in, they put money in, they put advisors in, they put equipment in, but they realize there are limits to how many Persians they want on the ground in Syria. So those two countries have a strong interest in an eventual exit strategy that secures their interest. And for Russia, it's the base in Tartus, and it's some degree of influence there. And Iran, it's the land bridge to continue supporting the Lebanese Hezbollah and to not lose face there. So I believe there is a deal there, but there's not a deal there without some pressure that includes, I think, more support to our forces on our proxies and allies on the ground.
Linda, thank you. Jiri Rajendran in the middle of the back half of the left-hand block.
Thanks very much, Giri, defense economist here at the Institute. I wonder if you could zoom in on a particular part of your presentation. You mentioned the strategy is right, but there's poor implementation of building up the ground partners. Now, you mentioned that the campaign is becoming more intelligence-driven, but I wonder if you can focus in on why is it being so hard to build up the ground partners? Is it mainly a problem on the Iraqi side to do with incentives and morale? Is it a trouble with access? I think you mentioned not so much U.S. access to the Sunni sort of elements of those forces there. So can you sort of break that up and talk about that a little bit more? And finally, have you seen in your research any credible estimates on how much money is going into this from all sides? Estimates of the size of the Mosul economy and so on, YPG, KRG, and so on. Any estimates, any indication of that would be really helpful, if very difficult. Thank you.
And on the aisle of the right-hand block, Brooks Newmark, who's at the back. Sorry, can you wait till the microphone reaches
Brooks Newmark, a member here and at Oxford. I've spent 10 years traveling to the region. I've probably met in the past 4.5 years at least 35 of the opposition groups within the wider FSA. Looking at things through the lens of Syrians, Syrians look at Assad as the biggest problem. They don't see ISIS. They say, we will deal with ISIS later, but 95% of the civilian deaths today are caused by Assad, with the Russians now in support. So my narrow question regarding that is, the best fighters on the ground within the FSA ambit still are Ahrar al-Sham and Jais al-Islam. Yet there seems to be a problem, certainly with the US government, in providing them the support that they need. And it's my view is it's rather better having them within the tent pissing out than moving outside and flaking off to ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra.
Good. May I,
Yeah.
please? I'll take both good questions in reverse order. Very good points. And as you know, I mean, Jaish al-Islam has been included in the High Negotiation Committee and Ahrar al-Sham hasn't. And the U.S. has kind of drawn a line saying that Ahrar al-Sham is too radical. But I fundamentally agree with your point of view, and I think the U.S. has moved toward a more realistic position of late. First, they were trying to identify, train, and equip entire units that were pledged to only fight ISIL. You were not going to find that among Syrians, and it was an abysmal failure. And I know General Nagata, who was in charge of that effort, and it was really criteria imposed on him by the policy level, and it was just never going to work. Now there's a much more, I think, flexible approach to say who is willing to serve our ends, but we're not going to put them to that litmus test. And certainly I think Western Syria and the anti-Assad campaign is something we've been supporting, largely through Saudi Arabia and others. But you know, this is something that the U.S. has been supportive of, and I believe that allowing these groups to be decimated on the ground by Russian air power is a terrible blow to U.S. credibility in the minds of the Syrian people, because you are right, their number one grievance is Assad. And that's the Gordian knot of this problem, is we cannot get the ground force we need without understanding their interests and their objectives. And I think that's really the art of this thing. In terms of, I would be happy to correspond with you about the aid figures, but I did skip over the key part of my analysis, and you've rightly asked me about this. We have had too few advisors constrained. It's not just numbers. The advisors have been constrained geographically, and they've been constrained by echelon. And in order to have an effective advisory, and this, I've spent a lot of time studying this, and when advisory missions are most effective is when they are able to provide advice at every echelon of the organization in a consistent and persistent way. Now, unfortunately, in the U.S., the debate got really hung up on JTACs, Joint Terminal Air Controllers, the guys that call in the airstrikes on the ground. There are multiple ways to go about that, and I do believe I'm very much in favor of continuing a precise air campaign. Carpet bombing doesn't get you anywhere to challenge one of our presidential candidates. But that is a tactical and minor issue. It is very important to have the right advisory configuration. The other key point is our materiel, our support, our system, the U.S. system for supplying materiel to forces is not a wartime system. It's a 2-year pipeline. It has to be revised. We have really been, and this is partly why they've gone to Iran. They've gone to other countries. They've gone to Russia. We can't even get our production lines for Humvees, which they badly need, ramped up to supply what we've agreed to provide them. So, and I understand the army disintegrated, it was politicized, and I know there are a lot of people saying, we put enough money into that rat hole, let's not do it. But we long-term have an interest in Iraq, and it is a major country in the region. And I've said from the beginning, I think a long-term relationship there is very much in the U.S. interest. But we can talk more about numbers if you'd like.
Okay, well, time marches on, and I got at least 5 potential questioners. So, Linda, if we may, are you prepared to take a salvo of 3 questions at once?
All you want.
On condition the questioners are very short and succinct. And there's the gentleman here in the bright blue sweater.
Daniel Porter, member of the Institute and student at King's College London. What I picked up on largely was the fact that ISIS aren't really witnessing a net loss in their forces, especially with around 1,000 being recruited each month. And just in line with what you were saying about how it really comes down to the Sunni populations worldwide to counter radicalization, how far do you think, precisely in Britain, we can work in line with Sunni populations, perhaps through prevent programs, and how specifically can we really implement that from a bottom-up level successfully?
Okay, thank you. And then there's a lady just behind him.
Hello, I'm Ali Ayoub with the Chinar Group. Great presentation, thank you very much for that. I guess I had a quick point and then a question. First was we haven't had very great success with leaders who've been toppled, be they in Iraq or Libya, with regards to gray zones that have been created. So just wanted us to all have in the back of our mind, what would a post-Assad regime actually look like? And secondly, with regards to, you rightly raised that, in terms of ISIL, the core group of fighters at the moment are either Iraqi, which I read to be as former Ba'athist, perhaps, Iraqi Ba'athists, as well as jihadists. Of the Ba'athists who would have been trained in the military, is there any sort of a program that could be built to try and perhaps reintegrate them, be it through utilizing psych-ops or information operations in order to draw them back in? I sort of breathed a bit of or maybe groaned a little bit on the countering violent extremist in asking billions of Muslims in the world to own up to owning the question of how to counter ISIL ideology, because I think a majority of the Muslim world would say we don't actually share the same line of thought. So just wanted to bat that back.
Interesting, two opposite ends of the telescope there, how this impacts the UK and then the global community of Sunni Muslims. And just behind the lady is Mark Caslow of the Institute.
Hi, my question, I just wanted to ask what the current thinking is, thinking very far ahead, on a future DDR process. Would this involve integrating ISIS fighters into a future Iraq security force? And if not, what do we do with them? What place do we have for ISIS members in a post-ISIS Iraq and Syria? If we don't have one, how do we remove their motivations to keep fighting?
Okay, thank you very much.
Terrific,
Linda.
and actually, yes,
Yeah.
all kind of related questions, very, very excellent ones. On the CV question, I do think that Britain, Australia, there's some good work going on in looking at your homegrown radicalization issue and how to get after that. But I would also say that, and I've focused heavily on my military analysis here, but military defeats will take the luster off of this group. So it will have an impact. And I think it's important not to think of a silver bullet here. But I do believe, and I acknowledge what the lady said about the difference between mainstream Islam and this phenomenon. But it is Islam that's being hijacked and distorted and used, and it is in the interest of the Sunni Muslim community to fight this, which is taking away their sons and daughters now, a very scary addition of many females going over under some illusion that this is a paradise. And we've done, actually, RAND has a good group of people looking at social media analysis to try to understand the motivating factors and what the dialogue is. We're using lexical analysis and social network analysis, using these widely available Twitter feeds and so forth, to just try to get into the mindset and provide, I think, more effective approaches. And the U.S. State Department is now on its third retooling of its strategic communications department, and that's why I do recognize no one, I think, has the answer yet. On the post-Assad regime, the Geneva formula is you get to a transitional government, and then you get to elections, and then you get to the new shape of Syria, which could be confederal or it could be micro-states. I mean, I think that really it's going to be very, very hard to put Syria back together. But in my view, you get the Gordian knot cut as soon as you get Assad moved off. And even if it's an acceptable figure to reach a diplomatic agreement among all of these parties, and Iran and Russia are the two parties in a position to pressure Assad. They absolutely can achieve this, and that is why I think we shouldn't go as beggars to these countries. We need to have enough muscle to say, this is in your interest, how do we get there? And I'm very hopeful that there'll be sustained energy behind that diplomatic initiative. And DDR, finally, and this blends into your other question, the hardcore leadership is really hardcore now of ISIL. These people, I don't know if you sampled any of this atrocious YouTube material they put out, but this is, the leadership is probably beyond redemption. But however, you have a 30,000 man force, and certainly many of these are motivated by local grievances, and they can be go successfully, I think, through a DDR process. And I think certainly some of these foreign fighters are people off on adventures, and they also can be successfully reintegrated. So I think there's a very clear distinction between the top hardcore leadership and the mass fighters.
I think a particularly difficult question for many governments whose citizens have been to the Islamic State and then come back is discerning whether they've come back for ulterior purposes or whether actually they've had enough and the adventure hasn't been turned out as they would have liked it. Linda, have you time for two more questions?
Yes, sure.
I think there were two questions in the middle of the front left. There was a lady and a gentleman. Can you catch my eye or catch the microphone bearer's eye? There's certainly one gentleman there.
Yes, thank you. Peter Asprey, Member Institute. Can you just, you talk about our ends. Do we have a clear idea yet of what our ends are? And if we don't, can you just rehearse the arguments against containment? You know, metaphorically putting a chain link fence around the area and waiting to see what for shapes to emerge. Thank you.
Okay, and is there anyone else who I've missed? Yeah, gentleman right here on the right of the front row.
James Drummond from HSBC. Just two sort of points of detail. One, what is the status of this Russian, Iraqi, Iranian joint HQ outside Baghdad that we read of a couple of months ago? And secondly, the Iraqi Air Force never features, and I know it's a long-standing sort of grievance, they want more hardware. And we read also that the Russians might be willing to supply sort of ground attack planes, etc., etc. Is this true? Is it a Potemkin village? What's going on?
Yes. Well, and we have, I'll take this one first and go to the other one. We have delivered some of the promised F-16s, and they're up at Balad. And this is, you know, they're going to eventually gain their own air support capability. But, you know, this is a long road. And they were out, the pilots were training in the U.S. before they took delivery in Balad, and there'll be more in the pipeline. So, but I just, and it's, of course, a much longer road in Afghanistan, where we've also been trying to equip them with an air capability. So I think clearly Iraq will get there before Afghanistan, but we have to look at that as a long-term thing, and they're going to need our air support, I think, for the duration. The Russia Operations Center kind of fizzled out because we immediately, the U.S. government, I'm not part of the U.S. government, made a démarche immediately saying, you know, if you're going to bring Russia into this campaign in a way that's going to conflict with what we're doing, we won't be able to do this, and they kind of backed off. And again, Abadi, you know, Abadi's just desperate. He's trying to get help from wherever he can. And that is why my argument is, if we ramp up support, we gain political influence, but we also keep out some of the other elements that he will bring in, the Iraqis will bring in just out of desperation. So I think there's a very hard, cold decision that we've got to make about what it will mean if we keep our support minimal. And that it leads me to this other question. And eventually there'll be a longer paper coming out. What Ben mentioned was the testimony I gave last June. But I believe if we fail at this, whether through continuing to supply inadequate means or the inherent difficulties of doing this, we will be left falling back with containment, because I don't believe anyone is sending any large ground forces into that country. And then we'll be left with trying to make containment work, but it is very hard. I mean, borders can't be sealed easily. This is a virtual political movement. You know, the phenomenon of ISIL is really not containable. We could, yes, put up a chain link fence, as you say, but it's going to have all kinds of seepage. And as I pointed out, they have set up a formidable outpost in Libya that can become its own generator, and that is totally not containable, because you have wide expanses, a lot of resources, a very narrow waterway over to Europe. And it's just, you know, I think this is where, again, I think SecDef Carter has said, we got to get the parent tumor, we got to work on the metastasis. And, you know, we understand the end. The end is really protect the homeland. I mean, that's the stock answer. But they use all kinds of D words: degrade, defeat, destroy. What we're really after, what the objective is to shrink this down to a manageable a phenomenon that will be terrorist, that will be criminal, that will be manageable by a host country force that we have helped build up. And it's going to take years.
Well, Linda, what a succinct way to end. For those of you who are interested in reading more of her work that isn't available on the excellent RAND website, I put copies of the summary of her Foreign Affairs article on the table by the coffee that you can pick up on the way out. One thing that didn't come up in questioning was Linda's tantalizing opening remarks about the way ISIS uses encrypted apps and about a conversation which cannot be described as a meeting of minds between the FBI and the US technology industry. Now, I mention that because at 1:30 this afternoon there's another event here which is looking at the darknet and encryption and the encryption wars. And those of you who haven't originally expressed an interest in attending, well, it's not too late. I think for those of you who are ISS members, you will find our coverage of both the war and the actors concerned in the Military Balance, which is published next week, quite interesting. There's what I hope you'll find a useful analysis of some of the tactics being used by both sides, particularly in Iraq. You'll also find some data, the best assessment we've got of the government forces of both Syria and Iraq, including our analysis of the air assets, which are not considerable, but they do exist in the Iraqi Air Force. I mean, I think if I may make one point from the chair, I mean, I found Linda's analysis extremely useful, and her point about the strategic communications. I do wonder if in the case of the United States, we have a country that is an entertainment advertising giant. You know, Hollywood, US music industry, and the power of Madison Avenue. You know, and you really have to ask the question, is that being leveraged in support of the battle of the narrative? Mind you, I would ask the same question even more pointedly at the UK government. But I think what Linda's explained is she's given us a really clear assessment of what's a really complicated conflict. And I was struck by her phrase about the potential further utility of Kurdish forces is that they're at the limit of their capability and their interest. And I think that really shows the intermingling of war and politics at every level, from the tactical to the operational to the strategic. And I just remind everybody that Linda is not a US government official, and rather like ISS, the analysis that she's been published is impartial and dispassionate. But thank you very much indeed, Linda, and will you join me in showing your appreciation?
Thank you very much.